A study of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Lesson 6, concerning marriage. This is taken from 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 40. Section 1. In view of their present situation, should believers get married? We must emphasize present situation. This question was raised in a letter that the Corinthians had sent to Paul. And we don't have enough historical information to know exactly what they were talking about. I think it probably was the general situation of being at total odds with the society in which they lived. It's not a specific situation, but the fact that they did not have any societal support for family life or for their religious life. The background of this chapter was Jesus' teaching concerning marriage in Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:1 through 12, Mark 10:1 through 12. The present crisis, as I've already said, while it's impossible to know for sure what that crisis was, I am of the opinion that it was the adoption of a policy making profession of faith in Christ a crime in the whole empire. There was no societal support for being a Christian. And every place you looked, you were surrounded by enemies. Under these circumstances, it was good for a believer not to be married. However, as Jesus says in Matthew 19:11 through 12, only those who have been given the gift of celibacy by God can reach that level of goodness. For the overwhelming majority of believers in any situation, civil war, peace, it is better to be married. It is not only better to be married, Paul says, in marriage, each spouse must lovingly and carefully meet the sexual needs and desires of their partners. Then he gives advice to the unmarried and to widows. For the same reasons, he has advised the church in general. In the previous text, he gives identical advice to the unmarried and the widows. Get married and remain faithful to your spouses. Perhaps he repeats the advice because the Corinthians had asked specifically about unmarried people and widows. Advice to those who were already married when they came to faith in Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. While divorce is possible for a believing woman married to an unbelieving husband, she must either remain celibate or remarry her husband. And the believing husband is bound by the same conditions. Then he gives advice to the others, the rest of the people, believers in Corinth. That's 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 17. Many believers today are confused by Paul's distinction between what he says on his own apostolic authority and what he passes on to his hearers as being from Christ. In making this distinction, he does not intend to diminish the authority of the former at the expense of the latter. The only difference between the two categories is that the latter teachings are always found in the synoptic gospels. When he says from the Lord, he means from Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You can check it out consistently, and he is consistent to the last degree. All of Paul's teachings in his epistles have the same authority, and that authority is the Christ. The teaching that a believer married to an unbelieving spouse who is willing to stay married should remain in that marriage. However, if the unbelieving spouse is not willing to stay in the marriage, the believing spouse is able to get a divorce but marry only another believer, else their children would be unclean. We're not going to go into that pretty complicated subject of children being clean and unclean. It's not necessary at this level of study. Paul uses this opportunity to state a general principle. 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24. The general principle is, those who have come to faith in Christ should not waste time and energy to change their social status. Paul's reasoning in the matter seems to be based on the amount of time and energy which would be wasted in trying to change the new believer's social status. That time and energy could be better spent in serving the kingdom. Paul makes an exception to this general principle in the matter of slavery. It was not all that difficult for a slave to become a free person, and both Roman law and social custom accommodated such a transition. But even in that case, freedom in Christ is much more important than freedom in society. Advice to the unmarried. 1 Corinthians 7:25 through 38. He emphasizes that the advice he is giving is based on the present crisis. Verse 26. The present crisis makes the maintenance of the status quo most desirable. Paul's teaching here is that a believer should not waste time and energy on changing their status. Rather, they should use both to cope with the crisis. The fact that a married believer naturally seeks the well-being of their family must not be interpreted to mean that unmarried believers are more dedicated to serving Christ than are the married. The paragraph which begins in verse 36 has often been used by commentators to postulate an institution composed of an unmarried male and female believer bound together in some sort of spiritual marriage. If such an institution has ever existed, it is not what Paul is discussing here. And I can find no firm evidence that such an institution ever existed in the church. it is better to apply the language to the ordinary relationship between unmarried male and female believers. And then the concluding two verses, the advice to married believers. That advice is, remember the language of Jesus in Matthew 19 concerning the purpose and permanence of marriage. Thank you, and have a good day.